The rooftop was dressed in soft blush and ivory, a pastel daydream set against the skyline. Paper lanterns floated above the guests like suspended thoughts. Everything smelled like white peonies and sparkling wine. The sign behind the dessert table read, "A New Bloom," in handwritten calligraphy, framed with eucalyptus and gold trim. I stepped out of the elevator alone, holding a box wrapped in cream paper, tied with gold twine, wearing the only dress I had that still fit. Vintage satin, ivory white, hemmed by hand pressed that morning. I had stitched the neckline tighter myself last week, trying to give it a new shape. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. When I walked in, the conversations quieted not dramatically, just enough to notice. Then Claire turned. Her hand was resting on her baby bump like a perfect accessory. She smiled wide and polished and said loud enough for the circle around her to hear, "Oh no. Is that the same costume from my engagement party? I swear you're trying to make poverty chic a trend." Laughter pealed softly around her. Someone lowered their glass, and someone else picked up their phone. I saw the quick flick of a camera flash caught out of the corner of my eye. No one said anything to stop her. I stood still. I didn't defend myself. I didn't walk away. I just placed the gift on the table beside the diaper cake and stepped back into the wallpaper. My dress rustled faintly as I moved, and for a moment, I became exactly what they wanted: silent, awkward, out of place. And yet somehow I still felt overdressed for the role they needed me to play. I had shown up wearing the only thing I could afford: my dignity, and apparently that was already too much. I was the second daughter, the middle girl, the one no one quite knew what to do with. Claire was the golden child, confident, photogenic, born with an instinct for performing femininity in a way that made mothers proud and strangers approving. I was strange. Not in the charming movie kind of way, but in the quiet, awkward way that made teachers pause during parent-teacher conferences. I was the girl who sketched shoes in the margins of my math notebook and hot-glued rhinestones onto canvas tote bags I found at the thrift store. I liked to cut up old shirts and use fabric markers to draw patterns no one else understood. Once in 6th grade, I brought a backpack I had sewn myself from scraps of curtain fabric and the side panel of a torn prom dress I'd found in my aunt's attic. No one said anything, but Claire laughed to school. She told me I looked like a budget Mary Poppins who got lost in a costume store. Our mom didn't intervene. She just shook her head, sighed, and muttered that I should focus on something real: science, math, or at least typing. I kept trying to express myself anyway for a while. On weekends, I'd tear pages out of fashion magazines from the library and trace silhouettes onto brown paper grocery bags. I even mailed in a design once to a local teen sewing contest, but never heard back. I didn't tell anyone I had entered. At home, creativity was treated like clutter, tolerated, but only in small doses and never in the living room. Claire's closet, meanwhile, was curated like a showroom. Every year before school started, Mom would take her to the outlet mall for new clothes. She always came back with 2 pairs of designer jeans and something with a little shimmer: Michael Kors, Calvin Klein, and even once a Kate Spade jacket. I got her hand-me-downs or worse dresses mailed from a distant cousin who worked at a department store in Oklahoma and sent leftovers in vacuum-sealed bags. My name was never on the box, just a label for the other one. I didn't complain, not out loud. But I noticed. I noticed when Claire got to pick what we wore for holiday photos, and I was always in a color that didn't match. I noticed when she was praised for having taste, and I was told to just wear something simple so I wouldn't clash with the table setting. The message was clear: blend in or be edited out. The one time I tried to do the opposite, I made a dress out of muslin and dyed it myself with turmeric and red wine, then layered it over a thrifted slip and wore it to our cousin's bridal shower. I had been nervous, but proud. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Claire took a picture of me by the punch bowl and posted it on her Instagram story with the caption, "She tried, bless her quirky little fashion heart." The worst part wasn't the post. It was that no one said anything about it. Not to her, not to me. Just silence. As if embarrassment was something I had brought upon myself, and now they were being polite by ignoring it. After that, I stopped designing anything I'd have to wear in front of my family. I still made things at night in my room and sketchbooks I never showed anyone, but I stopped trying to be seen. It hurt less that way. Every holiday, every graduation, every party or engagement event, the same thing would happen. I'd get a text from Mom or Claire usually 2 days before. Just keep it simple, okay? Soft colors, nothing too bold. We're going for a clean aesthetic. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. Don't make us look bad. Don't draw attention to yourself. Don't be difficult. I started to believe them. Maybe I didn't have taste. That maybe the things I loved, frayed hems, asymmetrical cuts, hand-stitched seams, weren't fashion, just failed attempts at relevance. I started folding my creations away in boxes and wore what was safest: muted cardigans, beige flats, taupe. So much taupe. I told myself it was maturity, that I was growing out of childish dreams. But deep down, a quiet part of me mourned the girl who used to believe a dress could be a doorway. I missed her. I missed how sure she was of her strange little visions. But I didn't know how to defend her anymore. Not in a world where family photos were color-coded and creativity was a costume you were only allowed to wear on Halloween. I kept my head down. I stayed out of the spotlight. And in doing so, I slowly erased the most vibrant parts of myself. I wasn't rejected outright. That would have been easier. I was just consistently, persistently overlooked until I started to look past myself too. It started quietly, almost accidentally, like a whisper you don't expect anyone to hear. After years of folding my creativity into the smallest corners of my life, I created a Pinterest account under a name that wasn't mine. I uploaded mood boards, palettes of deep rust, ocean, teal tulle, over raw silk asymmetry, softened by embroidery silhouettes borrowed from dreams I used to have when I was 11 and sketching on grocery bags. I didn't follow anyone. I didn't like or comment. I just saved it. I collected shapes and shadows, textures, a way back to myself. At night, after finishing the closing shift at a bookstore, I would sit cross-legged on the floor of my rented apartment, using the same sewing machine my great-aunt once mended curtains with. I patched fabric onto mannequin frames made from bent wire and masking tape. I painted florals onto recycled silk I had thrifted for $3.49 a yard, layering them beneath gauze and mesh-like buried secrets. Nothing was perfect, but something was growing. I began to photograph pieces on myself. Never my face, never my name. Cropped images of sleeve details, high necklines, and skirts in motion. I uploaded them to a Tumblr account I never promoted. Just images bathed in natural light with captions like, Untitled 3, or for the ones who dream in the thread. I didn't tell my family. I didn't tell anyone. The work was just for me, a quiet rebellion stitched in the moonlight. But the internet has a strange way of pulling threads loose. One morning, I woke up to 82 notifications. A fashion blogger, massive the kind with brand partnerships and runway seats, had found my work and reposted a composite of 3 of my designs. Her caption read, "I don't know who this is yet, but she might be the most exciting unknown designer I've seen this year." The post had gone viral. My inbox filled with questions. Where could they buy the pieces? Were commissions open? Was there a name, a brand, a story? I didn't answer. Not yet. I wasn't ready to be seen, but I was ready to move. I created a studio named Aurélien. No last name, no bio. Just a simple site with 6 photos, 3 contact buttons, and no explanation. The first collection sold out in under 24 hours. I reinvested every dollar into better thread, better fabric, and a newer machine. But I still worked from my floor, still ate instant ramen, and wore the same thrifted coat every day. The clothes were never about showing off. They were about proof that I hadn't been wrong about beauty, that what I saw had value. Within 6 months, I was approached for a capsule collection collaboration. A limited run, 12 gowns, all hand-stitched and made to order. I designed each one like it was a letter I had never sent. Each fabric felt like an apology I had owed myself. I didn't tell my sister. I didn't tell anyone. And still, somehow the gowns made their way into photo shoots, into tiny boutiques in Milan and Brooklyn, into the wish lists of women I had only read about in Vogue profiles. The third piece in the collection was special. It was built around the bones of something old, something personal. It began with the silhouette of the dress my sister once mocked me for wearing. I kept the neckline, but altered the slope, shifted the waistline higher, and added hand-stitched vines crawling along the side seams. I layered soft lace over brushed satin and painted tiny constellations across the hem in fabric-safe gold ink. It was no longer a symbol of shame. It had become a reclamation. When I submitted that dress anonymously to FashionAid, a nonprofit design auction that donates proceeds to textile sustainability, it was meant to be a quiet offering. I didn't attend the event. I didn't even check the results until 2 days later. But there it was in the center of the gallery webpage, lot number 73. Untitled, by Aurélien, final bid, $75,000. I read the number twice. Then again. I sat down on the kitchen floor staring at the screen surrounded by thread spools and sketches and the faint sound of the radiator humming. It didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like stillness, like being seen without needing to explain. The press began circling after that. Who was Aurélien? Why no face? Why no interviews? But I said nothing. I kept designing. I kept sending. I kept the silence not out of fear anymore, but out of choice. Because I had learned something sacred in the quiet. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is build a world where no one gets to tell her what beautiful looks like, not even her own family. I wasn't famous. I wasn't finished. But I was no longer invisible. The invitation arrived exactly 1 week after the auction closed. Pale pink envelope, gold embossed font calligraphy that tried a little too hard to whisper elegance. My name wasn't handwritten, it was printed. Mass mailing style. Inside the card read, "We're so excited to celebrate Claire and baby Bloom. Join us for a sweet afternoon of tea, laughter, and love." And then, at the bottom in smaller script, almost an afterthought, "Dress code, keep it clean and classy. No weird colors." I laughed. Not out loud. Just the kind that lingers in your throat like a tickle. "No weird colors," I repeated, placing the card down beside my sketchbook where a half-formed design lay unfinished in wine red lace and emerald velvet. It was funny. The timing. I hadn't spoken to Claire in weeks, not since the last holiday dinner, where she told me I looked like I got lost on my way to a Renaissance fair. And now she wanted me to come to her baby shower, clean and classy. As if my presence had always been a threat to the aesthetic. I might have ignored it. I almost did, but 2 days before the invitation arrived, I had received another message, this one less perfumed, more electric. A stylist, the one who had purchased my third gown anonymously at FashionAid, had reached out with an offer. He wanted me to appear on a television series, one that spotlighted anonymous designers and revealed them live to the fashion world. "Your moment," he wrote. "The world deserves to meet you." I had stared at that email for hours. Read it in the light of early morning and again just past midnight. My hands had hovered over the keyboard over the possibility of stepping out fully finally. But I declined. Not because I wasn't ready, but because that wasn't the story I wanted to tell. I didn't want to be revealed under studio lights with cue cards and edited montages. I didn't want applause from strangers who had never doubted me. No. If I was going to be seen, it had to be real, unscripted, honest. I didn't know then that the universe had already planned it for me. The baby shower was being held at the Halcyon, a boutique hotel known for its minimalist rooftop and marble glass atrium. What no one in my family knew, not even Claire, was that the Halcyon had just begun a month-long partnership with FashionAid to display select designs from the most successful auction lots in their lobby gallery. One of those gowns, the centerpiece, was mine. Untitled. 3. The gown Claire had once mocked the bones of. Now reborn encased in a glass display next to a brass plaque that read, "Aurélien donated for textile sustainability, sold for $75,000. I didn't plan it that way. I didn't make a call or pull a string. But there it was. Fate. Irony. Justice wrapped in soft light and velvet ropes. The morning of the shower, I stood at my mirror and ran my hands over the hem of a dress I had finished just days earlier. Not the one from the gallery, but its echo. A custom piece, inspired by the same structure, but reimagined deeper. Neckline, boulder, stitching, storm. Gray undertone with pearl threading across the waist, like rainfall in motion. It wasn't revenge. It was resurrection. The lobby was already filled with guests when I arrived. Some I recognized, but most I didn't. Women in beige wrap dresses carrying pastel gift bags and cupcakes balanced on paper plates. I walked past the gallery without pausing. I didn't need to see it. I already knew it was there. But they didn't. Not yet. The elevator ride to the rooftop was quiet. A mother and daughter stood beside me complimenting my shoes in a soft voice, as if unsure if I was someone they were supposed to recognize. When the doors opened, music floated through the air early 2000s, pop ironic and sweet, and the pastel scene unfolded like a magazine spread. Claire stood near the center, radiant in cream silk, her bump perfectly round beneath a sash that read, "Mama to be." Her eyes scanned the room, then landed on me. For a flicker of a second confusion, then recognition, then a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You made it," she said. "Wow, that's quite a dress." "Thanks," I said. "It's a one of one." I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. She blinked once, then turned to hug someone else. I made my way through the crowd, placing my gift on the table with the rest. No one else commented, but I could feel the shift, the tiny currents of attention. A few whispered to each other. One guest asked me where I got my gown. I simply smiled. It wasn't arrogance. It was peace. And then, as fate would have it, someone's child, maybe 4 years old, ran out of the elevator into the rooftop clutching a museum brochure and shouting, "Mommy, look, this dress is downstairs. I saw it." Eyes turned. Claire turned. A pause. A ripple of confusion, then curiosity. "What do you mean, sweetie?" a woman asked. The little girl pointed directly at me. "That one. It's in the glass box downstairs." Murmurs. 2 guests slipped away toward the elevator. Claire's mouth opened, but no words came. I stood still, holding nothing, carrying everything. And in that moment, I understood what true silence could feel like, not empty, but full, not lonely, but sacred. I hadn't needed an announcement. I hadn't needed applause. The work had spoken long before I ever entered the room. She arrived 15 minutes late. Not dramatically so, just enough to ensure people had already gathered, already settled, already stopped, scanning the door. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped out alone, walking slowly, deliberately. Her dress wasn't loud. It didn't shimmer in neon or sparkle under spotlights. It glowed instead, like a secret you weren't supposed to see. The original Aurelian piece, the one auctioned just a week prior for $75,000. She had altered it slightly for movement, softened the waist, added pearl-weighted seams, so the gown moved with gravity instead of against it. White-gray base sheer tulle overlay, embroidered with silk thread, each pattern forming the shape of constellations only visible from certain angles. There was a gold insignia, the studio's symbol hidden along the side hem, brushed into the fabric like memory into stone. No one recognized her. Not at first. Not the mothers. Not the old friends of Claire's, who now whispered over mocktails. They thought she might have been a model from a brand activation, or perhaps a late stylist dropping by in support of some other creative. One woman actually asked, "Are you part of the shoot team?" She just smiled and shook her head. Claire saw her next. Her eyes widened ever so slightly, not alarmed, but vaguely annoyed like a hostess spotting an uninvited guest who technically had an invite. She approached with a confident smile. She leaned in and whispered in that saccharine drawl of hers, the one she used at bridal fittings and charity luncheons, "Love your costume. Looks like someone's trying a little too hard." It wasn't angry, it was worse. It was dismissive, her default setting, the assumption that anything she didn't understand could be minimized into kitsch. The younger woman tilted her head slightly, lips still pressed in a smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. "Thanks," she said softly. "It's original. Auctioned last week. That was all." She turned her body slightly away enough to indicate the conversation had ended without permission. Claire opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. There was a pause. Then, from across the room, a woman's voice, bright but startled. "Wait, I know that dress." People turned. The woman, mid-30s, sharp red bob phone in hand, stepped forward with purpose. Her name was Camille, senior editor at Vellum, a boutique fashion magazine with enough cult following to shape opinion. She pointed toward the hem, her eyes darting between the gown and the wearer. "This is it, isn't it, the Aurelienne original? Lot number 73. I saw it at Halcyon just last week. It was all over our design brief for spring." A ripple ran through the crowd. One woman gasped. Another tilted her head, processing the reference. Claire's expression shifted, first confusion, then something harder flickering just beneath the skin. "You're the designer?" Camille asked. Not accusing, not hostile, just astonished. "Are you, Aurelienne?" The girl didn't nod. She didn't correct. She didn't claim. She simply met Camille's gaze and said quietly, "That piece wasn't meant to be worn again. But I wanted to see how it felt in a room like this." The tone wasn't arrogant. It was deliberate, grounded. And then she bowed her head slightly, like a dancer stepping back after a final movement. The room hushed. In the stillness, you could hear the clink of a fork against china. Someone dropped a strawberry onto a napkin. No one laughed. No one clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was heavier than that, the kind of recognition that doesn't require applause. Claire stood frozen, her mouth slightly parted as if searching for a response that didn't exist. How do you respond to someone whom you once called invisible, only to discover the world had already started applauding her in your absence? There was no breakdown, no shouting, no dramatic exposure, just the most brutal kind of revelation, one dressed in grace. Guests began to murmur. Phones came out. But she didn't pose, didn't perform. She walked calmly to the far corner of the terrace where a few white chairs were scattered under string lights. She took a seat, folded her hands in her lap, and watched as the space filled with a low hum of recalibration. Camille eventually came over again, more composed. "We've been trying to find you for weeks," she said. "There's a whole campaign happening around anonymous artisans in couture. You're at the center of it." The girl just smiled, but there was no thrill in it. Just quiet confirmation. "Not sure if I want to be found," she said. "I think I just needed to be seen once in a room that never saw me before." And that was the line. That was the moment. Because nothing was louder than the quiet in that room. The weight of 1,000 assumptions collapsing all at once. She didn't need to announce who she was. Her work had done it for her. She didn't need to shame her sister. The silence had already spoken louder than any insult could. In that moment, surrounded by the very people who had once overlooked her, she stood not as a guest, not as a prop, not as a sister. She left before the cake was cut. No grand goodbye, no whispered exit. Just a quiet drift toward the elevator, the same way she had entered, alone, certain, untethered. The city outside was still bright with late afternoon light, golden and kind. Her heels clicked against the marble floor of the Halcyon lobby as she passed the gown display one last time, not pausing, not needing to. It had already served its purpose. The cab ride home was short, muted. The driver played soft jazz on low volume, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to sit in complete silence without rushing to fill it with explanation, apology, or plan. When she reached her apartment, she dropped her keys into the bowl by the door, slipped off the gown, hung it carefully on the dress form, and stepped into the kitchen barefoot. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. What she felt was something rarer, the gentle hum of having nothing left to prove. The weight of trying, of explaining, of earning visibility had been left behind somewhere between the rooftop and the hotel lobby. She brewed tea, sat by the window, and opened her sketchbook. Not the public one, not the one filled with proposals and capsule collection thumbnails, but the private one, the one that still had turmeric stains on the edges and torn pages where she had once scrawled angry words across failed patterns. She flipped to a blank sheet and drew a neckline she had dreamt of once but never dared to create. She sketched until it made sense. Then she turned to the inside cover and wrote a single line. This time, I wore my truth. And it fit better than anything they ever tried to put me in. No hashtags, no captions, no post. Some things didn't need to be seen to exist. Later that evening, her phone buzzed. Messages, notifications. A few guests from the shower tagging her in blurry Instagram stories, vague captions like the dress or that moment. Even Camille had posted a photo of the gown, with the simple line, "When anonymity walks louder than celebrity." But she didn't reshare it. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Something had shifted, not just in how others saw her, but in how she now saw herself, not as someone finally worthy of the room, but as someone who had never needed the room in the first place. The little girl who once drew shoes on napkins had made it through, not by shouting, not by fighting, but by outlasting, by refusing to be edited down to something beige and agreeable. Somewhere in the world, people were now talking about Aurélien. Maybe a blogger was writing about her minimal aesthetic, or a fashion house was circling her name for collaboration. But here in this room with a mug of lukewarm tea and a gown draped like history over a mannequin's shoulder, she wasn't thinking about legacy. She was just thinking about next season. Not to impress, not to dominate, but to create. For the first time, design no longer felt like a way to escape. It felt like a way to return. The studio was quiet. No spotlight, no applause. Only fabric and thread, and the knowledge that she had stepped back into herself fully, fearlessly. There would always be people like Claire. People who curated aesthetics like armor, who mocked difference to preserve their own definition of elegance. But they no longer had power over her. Not because they had changed, but because she had stopped trying to enter their world and started building her own. A world where weird colors were sacred, where failed patterns became stories, where being too much was a design principle, not a flaw. She glanced at the clock. Midnight. She stood stretched and turned off the overhead light. Before heading to bed, she opened her notes app and jotted something. It wasn't for a collection. It wasn't for a client. It was for someone she hadn't met yet. If you've ever been told you're too loud, too awkward, too off-trend, too not the vibe, know this. Beauty doesn't live in the mouths of those who accept you. It lives where you dare to choose yourself, even if they laugh, even if they walk away. Especially then. She saved the note. Not posted, not shared, just held. Somewhere another girl was being asked to dress simpler, to speak softer, to take up less space. And maybe one day she'd find this story. Maybe she'd see the dress in a magazine, or pass it in a gallery and feel something stir. Maybe she'd recognize the shape of a truth she thought only she carried. And maybe she'd start sketching again. That was enough. That was everything. Because in the end, the loudest kind of revenge wasn't loud at all. It was peace. Peace was so quiet it didn't ask to be understood. It simply refused to be erased. But as the architect of her presence, and that perhaps was the sharpest victory of all,